Okay, the day is almost done. I think it's 3 o'clock. Just back from a nice ski. Lots of caribou tracks in the area and some moose tracks. Always nice to see them. Yesterday we saw a small herd. But let's talk about bees. So, just an add-on to the insulation talk. The thing about insulation is, actually, let's step back. Bees, when they're exposed to colder temperatures, will cluster. So what insulation does is it helps retain heat inside the colony or in the hive box, so that it actually delays the clustering process. So clustering is a cold stress reaction adaptation of the bees. So where they cluster together and tighten, and then the bees stick their butts out in the mantle, and it's a way for them to conserve heat or transfer heat from the core of the cluster to the outside to keep those mantle bees warm. So the thing to remember is an insulated colony with minimal top venting. What happens is the heat stays inside. So what it does, it actually delays clustering. So the bees will be looser in there longer. And they'll be less stressed. People think, oh, they'll consume more because they're active. They're not really active. They're just lazing around. So what I'll do at the end of this video, I'll clip on a time lapse that I did a couple years ago. I think it was 2021. And it's a hourly snapshot of the cluster. I think it's a couple clusters. It was 2 singles and a control hive, and then you can see how the cluster does move around at different temperatures. And I think the video ends at I think it's like -40 out, and you can see that, yeah, it's the exposures on top is around that 5 to 8 degrees, and then I did have some sensors underneath the cluster, and the temperatures there at -40 were like -5 to -10. Which is actually not that bad, because I'd rather be exposed to -5 than -40. And that's what insulation does. It lowers the exposure of the bees by keeping the heat inside the box longer. What it also does is, especially in a well-sealed box, retained heat means that the bees need to consume less honey to generate that heat. Consumed honey actually is moisture. It generates a lot of metabolic moisture. So for every pound of honey, I think it's 1.25 cups of water or vapor that the bees need to deal with. So a lot of people talk about bees that get dehydrated and stuff. And I'd say in a decent setup like this, the bees do not get dehydrated because they have access to that moisture inside. And at warmer temperatures, the bees, or actually the air, can hold more moisture before it condenses out. So that's another plus. And because of the higher temperatures, it also means that the dew point is higher. And in this setup here, the dew point is typically around 15 to 20 degrees Celsius. So it means that as the water hits the front side, you can see that the 3 sides have more insulation. So it means that the front side is the condensing wall. So it means that moisture will condense in the corners, likely at the front, and then it leaks down. And then the water's fairly warm. So if the bees are thirsty, they can actually go and drink it. And in general, I'd say above -20, the bees are in a loose cluster and they're well able to move around. So in a nutshell, that's the clustering. And what I'll do is I'll share a chart. It was developed by Southwick, Dr. Southwick, and it's about the metabolic rate of a kilogram of bees versus exposed or ambient temperatures. The thing to remember is that ambient temperature is based on a colony that has R1 with no insulation. So when you're adapting these models to our bees that are in insulated boxes, that ambient temperature actually becomes more of a local temperature. And that local temperature is the temperature below the cluster, because that tends to be the coldest temperature in the box. And hence, when I do my modeling, and the reason I like having a sensor on the bottom board below the cluster, especially in a smaller volume, it gives me an idea of what the temperatures the bees are exposed at. And hence the reason I can say what I say around what the estimated metabolic rates are on these bees, because I do have a sensor in there. Last thing I'm going to talk about, because I don't want to go too long, is surface areas. So you can see that in the app that I just uploaded on my website is you can choose the number of boxes. The top is fixed, and all you do for the top is you add your R value. But for every box you add, excuse me, cold air in my lungs. For every box you add, you increase the surface area. So if the cluster is not that big, what it means that more heat will get lost, and the bees' environment will be a lot more difficult to keep warm. So hence the reason this year I'm kind of disappointed in myself, because most of my colonies are in doubles, because work was just too busy. And so it means that if you use the app and go from one deep box to a double, so a double deep box, you can see that it increases heat loss potential by quite a bit. And then it increases honey consumption and increases water generation. So thing to remember again, you've got cluster-driven wintering and you've got enclosure-driven wintering. So the more insulation you have, the more it'll be enclosure. And if you don't insulate, it just means that the bees will use their mantle to protect themselves as good as they can. If you don't get any minus 40s and stuff like that, chances are the bees could survive. Just make sure your seams are well protected and the bees do have a dry environment. And that's usually the crux of the problem, is in that context is the clusters being exposed to pretty much the outside temperature. Hence, the metabolic rate goes up, and then you can actually convert those watts of energy into water generation. And hence the reason a lot of you, if you don't insulate in decently cold weather, produces a lot of moisture. So you can see that there's a cycle there between how much insulation, how much is going to reduce honey consumption, because honey consumption is related to moisture, and it goes around in circles. So at some point you need to find that proper cutoff. So again, cluster-driven wintering, enclosure-driven wintering. And just so you know, in those wooden boxes, when the bees start brooding late winter, early spring, the box becomes the driving factor. So the heat loss of the box becomes critical, and hence the reason consumption spikes up is you've just added now, they're trying to maintain that internal temperature at 95F or 35C to start raising brood inside that box. So the bees are actually using most of that energy not for raising brood, but for keeping the box warm enough to raise brood. And the thing you need to remember is currently these boxes don't really have brood. So they're maintaining their core at maybe 23, 25C. If they start doing micro brooding in the winter, then they'll just keep that local area at that 35C, 95F. But once I add pollen patties in these boxes in late March, that box is going to go up to 35 degrees Celsius. So it means that the temperature difference between inside and outside increases by 15 degrees, which if you do the calculation on heat loss, it actually increases the energy consumption that the bees have. So hopefully I didn't confuse you too much. But I guess the next talk I'll do is on ventilation, and then the relationship between the bottom entrance and the top entrance, and then some natural behaviors I've seen in my boxes that the bees do to actually ensure that there's natural convective currents in there. So I call it a vent channel. It's quite interesting, but you can see that the bees are well adapted for even this cold environment here. So anyways, till next time, cheers.